Have you ever felt an invisible wall forming between you and the people around you as you grow older? Maybe friends who once called regularly seem distant. Family members who used to cherish your presence now appear impatient or preoccupied. Even strangers who once greeted you with warmth now seem indifferent. It's subtle at first, a missed invitation here, a shorter phone call there, but over time, the pattern becomes undeniable. People are drifting away, and the most painful part, you don't know why. Is it them? Is it you? Or is it simply the nature of life unfolding? The truth is, aging doesn't have to mean losing connection, but there are certain invisible forces at play, and if we don't recognize them, we risk isolating ourselves without even realizing it. Here's the thing. People don't just start avoiding you without reason. In many cases, it's small, unconscious habits, patterns of thought, speech and action that create distance. And the good news, once you understand these behaviors, you have the power to change them. From a Buddhist perspective, life is constantly changing, and so are our relationships. Impermanence is the nature of existence, but disconnection is not inevitable. By cultivating mindfulness and making conscious shifts in how we interact, we can foster warmth, respect, and deeper bonds in our later years rather than pushing people away. In this video, we will uncover 6 common behaviors that may be unknowingly creating distance between you and the people you love. More importantly, we will explore how to transform these challenges into opportunities for connection, growth, and genuine companionship. Because aging should not mean fading away, it should mean deepening the richness of your relationships and embracing the wisdom of your years. Let's begin. 1. The weight of negativity. Shifting from complaint to gratitude. Life is not for the faint of heart. By the time you reach 70, you've weathered storms that younger generations can't even begin to imagine. You've said painful goodbyes, faced the creeping uncertainties of aging, and watched the world change so drastically that at times it barely feels familiar. And let's be honest, some of those changes aren't for the better. The aches and pains that once seemed like small annoyances now linger longer. Friends who were once a phone call away have either moved on or passed on. Society moves faster, and sometimes it feels like it has left you behind. It's only natural to feel the weight of it all. But here's the catch. When you carry that weight into every conversation, it becomes something others start to avoid. No one enjoys being around someone who always sees the glass as half empty. People may start calling less, shortening visits, or politely changing the subject when certain topics arise. Not because they don't care, but because negativity is emotionally draining. Buddhism teaches us that our words and thoughts hold immense power. The Buddha once said, "We are shaped by our thoughts. We become what we think." If your thoughts are constantly dwelling on what is wrong, what has been lost, what used to be, and how unfair life feels, you will inevitably radiate that energy outward. And people, whether they realize it or not, pick up on that energy. Take, for example, an elderly man named Walter. Walter had lived a long, full life, but as the years went by, he found himself bitter about everything. At family gatherings, he would sit in the corner, grumbling about how his grandchildren never put their phones down, how his neighborhood had changed, how doctors didn't know what they were doing anymore. Slowly, his children stopped inviting him as often. His friends started making excuses, and Walter, hurt and frustrated, convinced himself that people just didn't respect their elders anymore. Then one day, an old friend named Henry paid him a visit. Henry, despite facing the same hardships, arthritis, loss, the struggles of aging, had an entirely different outlook. He listened to Walter complain for a while before finally saying, "You know, Walt, I've got the same aches and pains you do. My grandkids are glued to their screens too. But when I sit with them, I ask them what they're watching. I let them teach me things. And you know what? They love it. They love sharing their world with me, and I get to stay a part of it. Life's different now, sure, but do you really want to spend whatever time you have left pushing people away? Walter was taken aback. That night, he thought about his friend's words. The next time his family visited, instead of complaining about phones, he asked his granddaughter to show him how hers worked. Instead of lamenting his old neighborhood, he reminisced about the good times he had there while acknowledging the new families making memories of their own. Little by little, he started to feel more included, more wanted, because instead of dwelling on loss, he focused on connection. A mindful approach. We're not saying you should force yourself to be cheerful all the time. Life has been hard, and those feelings are valid. But try balancing every frustration with a moment of appreciation. If you catch yourself about to complain, pause and ask, is this what I want to bring into this conversation? Instead of saying, things were better back in my day, try saying, you know, I've seen so much in my lifetime, and it's fascinating to watch how the world keeps evolving. Instead of listing aches and pains, share something you're still grateful for, a moment of comfort, a favorite book, a small kindness from a stranger. The truth is, people don't avoid negativity because they don't care. They avoid it because it makes them feel worse. And if you want to keep meaningful relationships strong, you must make sure that when people leave a conversation with you, they feel lighter, not heavier. 2. Unsolicited advice. The Art of Letting Go. By 70, you've gathered a lifetime of wisdom. You've seen trends rise and fall, mistakes unfold, and lessons hard-earned through personal experience. Naturally, there's a deep-seated desire to pass this knowledge on, to steer younger generations away from pitfalls you've encountered, to protect them from the same heartaches, disappointments, and regrets. After all, isn't that what wisdom is for? But here's the thing. What is meant as guidance is often received as judgment. Take Eleanor, for instance. She was a mother, a grandmother, and a woman who had built her life on resilience. She had grown up in a time when hard work was the only guarantee of survival, when discipline was the backbone of a good life. So when she saw her grandson, Alex, struggling with his finances, spending recklessly, and seemingly taking life for granted, she couldn't help herself. Every conversation turned into a lecture. You should be saving more. Back in my day, we didn't waste money like this. Or you really need to get serious about your future before it's too late. She believed she was helping. But Alex, he started avoiding their weekly calls. Visits became shorter. He rarely confided in her anymore. One day, at a family gathering, Eleanor overheard Alex laughing with his uncle, discussing financial investments. She felt a pang of hurt. Why does he listen to him but not to me? Later that evening, she asked her daughter about it. Her daughter hesitated before saying, "Mom, it's not that he doesn't value your advice. It's just, he feels like every conversation with you turns into a critique. He needs to figure things out on his own." It hit Eleanor like a ton of bricks. She wasn't guiding, she was correcting. She wasn't inspiring, she was imposing. And in doing so, she had created distance instead of connection. Buddhism teaches us about non-attachment, even to our knowledge. When we impose advice, we are clinging to the belief that others should think and act as we do. We assume that our way is the only right way. But true wisdom is not about forcing insights onto others. It's about allowing them the space to seek it when they are ready. A wise teacher does not impose, they inspire. A mindful approach. Instead of jumping in with solutions, try pausing. If you see a loved one struggling, instead of saying, "You shouldn't be doing that," ask, "Would you like to hear what I've learned from my experience?" If they say yes, share your wisdom with humility. If they say no, let it go. Trust that their path, however winding, will teach them in its own way. And something incredible happens when we respect others' autonomy. They start seeking our guidance willingly. Instead of bracing themselves for unwanted lectures, they come to us with open hearts, ready to listen, not because they have to, but because they want to. Eleanor learned this the hard way. The next time she saw Alex, she resisted the urge to tell him what he should be doing. Instead, she simply asked, "How's everything going?" She listened, and to her surprise, at the end of their conversation, Alex asked, "Grandma, what would you do if you were in my position?" It was the first time in a long time that he had sought her wisdom. She smiled, took a breath, and said, "Well, let me tell you what I learned the hard way." 3. Resistance to change. Embracing the present, change is relentless. It marches forward, indifferent to our nostalgia, unmoved by our longing for the comfort of the familiar. And as we age, that forward motion can feel unsettling, almost as if the world is slipping through our fingers, reshaping itself into something unrecognizable. It's tempting then to take refuge in the past, to retreat into the well-worn stories of the good old days. After all, there was a time when everything felt simpler, when people had deeper connections, when music had soul, and when a handshake meant something. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Clinging to the past doesn't bring it back. It only makes the present harder to live in. Take Margaret, for example. She was 76, proud and fiercely independent. She had lived through wars, seen the rise and fall of industries, and watched her once quiet town transform into a bustling city. She had raised 3 children, all of whom now had families of their own. And yet, as the years passed, she felt increasingly left behind. The world seemed to be moving at a pace she couldn't keep up with. People barely called anymore. Texting had replaced phone conversations. Grandkids were glued to screens, talking about things she didn't understand. Social norms were shifting, and she found herself grumbling under her breath. Kids these days have no respect. Everything is upside down. It wasn't like this before. One afternoon, Margaret's youngest granddaughter, Sophie, visited with a bright smile and a phone in hand. "Grandma, I want to show you something," she said excitedly, pulling up a video of a young musician playing the piano. Margaret barely glanced at it before dismissing, "That's not real music. Back in my day, musicians had true talent." Sophie's smile faltered. She put her phone away and the conversation fizzled. Margaret didn't think much of it until visits from Sophie started becoming rare. The once lively girl who used to chatter excitedly about her life now kept things brief. Margaret could feel the distance but couldn't quite grasp what had changed. Then, one day, her son sat her down. "Mom, the world is different now. It's not worse, just different. When you refuse to even listen, you make it hard for the kids to connect with you. They love you, but they don't want to feel judged every time they share something." It stung. But that night, Margaret sat in her chair, staring at the very same phone she had so often resented. She hesitated, then picked it up and scrolled through photos her family had sent her. She saw a picture of Sophie at a concert. Eyes lit up with passion, and she realized something. She didn't have to love every change, but she could at least try to understand. The next time Sophie visited, Margaret did something unexpected. "Sweetheart, show me that musician again." Sophie's eyes widened in surprise, then joy. She pulled up the video, and this time, Margaret listened. She still preferred the classics, but for the first time, she saw Sophie's world through her eyes. That small moment, a shift from resistance to curiosity, brought them closer. Buddhism teaches us that impermanence is the essence of life. The river never stays still, the seasons never freeze in place, and neither do we. Resisting change is like trying to hold on to water. It only slips through our fingers faster. When we fight against the inevitable, we suffer. But when we lean into it with an open heart, we find that there is still joy, still connection, still life to be embraced. A mindful approach. Instead of dismissing new trends outright, ask questions. If your grandchildren love a new kind of music, listen with an open mind. If technology feels foreign, see it as an opportunity to learn. If social norms evolve, observe without judgment. Change isn't something to fear, it's a bridge, one that, if crossed with curiosity rather than resistance, can lead us to deeper understanding, richer relationships, and a life that remains vibrant, no matter how much the world around us shifts. 4. Expecting too much without giving back. Relationships are like a delicate dance, give and take, push and pull. They are sustained by balance, by mutual care, by the simple but profound act of reciprocity. Yet, as we grow older, that balance can become harder to maintain. Our roles shift. The independence we once prided ourselves on begins to wane, and we may find ourselves needing more from family, from friends, from the world around us. And that's okay. Needing help is not the problem. Expecting it without appreciation is. Take Henry, for instance. At 82, he was once the pillar of his family, the man who worked tirelessly, who built a home with his own hands, who never needed to ask for help. But time had other plans. His body slowed, his eyesight weakened, and simple tasks became exhausting. His children and grandchildren loved him dearly, but over time, they began to feel a quiet weight. Henry expected them to visit, to call, to run errands, to sit and listen whenever he wanted company. Yet, when they did, he barely acknowledged their effort. If his daughter spent the afternoon helping him with groceries, he'd simply nod and move on. If his grandson drove 30 minutes just to share a meal, Henry would complain that he didn't visit enough. Slowly, those visits became less frequent. Calls grew shorter. The love was still there, but so was the quiet resentment. His family wasn't avoiding him because they didn't care. They were avoiding him because being around him felt like an obligation, not a joy. One day, his lifelong friend Albert paid him a visit over a cup of tea. Albert said, "You know, Henry, I read something interesting the other day. They say gratitude is like sunshine. The more you give it, the warmer people feel. And when people feel warm, they want to stay. But when you hold it back, things get cold, and folks don't like standing in the cold for too long." That night, Henry sat alone and thought about it. He realized something that made his heart sink. He had been receiving without giving. The next time his daughter came by, instead of simply expecting her help, he reached for her hand and said, "I don't say it enough, but I appreciate you, sweetheart. Thank you for everything you do." She smiled, genuinely smiled, for the first time in a long time. The warmth returned. Buddhism teaches us the power of selfless giving. Giving is not always about grand gestures. It's about the small, everyday moments where we acknowledge, appreciate, and uplift others. Even if we can no longer give in the ways we once did, we can still offer kindness, patience, wisdom, and above all, gratitude. A thank you, a story shared, a genuine interest in someone else's life. These are gifts too. A mindful approach. Take a moment to reflect. When someone visits, don't just expect their presence, cherish it. Ask about their life, listen without interruption, show appreciation. If someone does you a favor, no matter how small, make them feel like it mattered, because it did. A grateful heart attracts, while entitlement repels. The choice is yours. 5. Living in the past. Finding joy in the present. There's something comforting about the past. The memories we cherish, the moments that defined us, the faces that once filled our days with laughter and meaning. It's natural to look back, to reminisce, to reflect, to hold on to the echoes of a time when everything felt familiar. But what happens when we linger there too long? When the past becomes a permanent home, rather than an occasional retreat? For George, a retired teacher in his late 70s, the past wasn't just a memory, it was where he lived. Every conversation started with, "Back in my day," and ended with a sigh about how things were so much better before. Whether he was with his grandchildren, his old friends, or even strangers at the local cafe, the pattern was the same. He spoke about how music had lost its soul, how young people had no manners, how the world had changed for the worse. At first, people listened politely. His grandchildren would nod as he told the same stories about his youth. His friends would chuckle at his complaints, and even his daughter would try to engage. But over time, something shifted. His friends started changing the subject more quickly. His grandchildren stopped visiting as often. His daughter, though patient, seemed distracted whenever he started reminiscing. One afternoon, his granddaughter, Emily, finally spoke up. "Grandpa, I love hearing about your past, but do you ever wonder what's happening in my life?" The question stunned him. He had never thought about it that way. Of course, he cared about her life. He loved her, but in his mind, sharing stories was his way of connecting. He hadn't realized that, from her perspective, it felt like he was stuck in a world she couldn't enter. That night, George sat in his quiet living room, looking at old photographs. The past was beautiful, but it was gone. And if he kept holding on to it so tightly, he would miss out on something just as precious: the present. Buddhism teaches that clinging to the past is a form of suffering. The Buddha once said, "Do not dwell in the past, do not dream of the future, concentrate the mind on the present moment." The past has shaped us, but it does not define who we are right now. The present moment is all we truly have. The next time Emily visited, George did something different. Instead of launching into another old story, he asked her about her favorite book. She lit up, excitedly telling him about a novel she was reading. He listened, truly listened, and for the first time in a long time, their conversation felt fresh, like a bridge between generations, not a one-way street into the past. A mindful approach. Reminiscing is beautiful, but balance is key. Instead of only looking backward, find ways to engage in the present. Take up a hobby, explore new places, or simply ask loved ones about their lives. If you share past experiences, do so with a purpose. Use them to offer wisdom, not just nostalgia. The past is a chapter, not the whole book. And if we allow ourselves to turn the page, we might just find that there are still incredible stories waiting to be lived. 6. Not respecting boundaries. Practicing loving detachment. Boundaries, such a simple word, yet so often misunderstood. As we grow older, our relationships evolve, and sometimes, without realizing it, we start expecting more than what others can give. We assume that because we've been there for our loved ones, they should always be available for us. We expect immediate responses to our calls, unannounced visits to be welcomed with open arms, and personal questions to be answered without hesitation. But here's the hard truth. Love doesn't mean ownership. Take Helen, for example, a widow in her early 80s. She adored her family, her children, grandchildren, even the neighbors she had known for decades. But lately, she had started feeling something she never thought she would: loneliness. Her son David had a demanding job. Her daughter, Linda, had a family of her own, and her grandkids. They were always busy, always in a rush. Helen hated how life had changed. She missed the days when they would come over unannounced, sit with her for hours, listen to her stories. Now, it felt like she had to chase their attention. And the more she chased, the further away they seemed. Every missed call felt like rejection. Every unanswered text stung. So she started calling more often, sometimes multiple times a day. She would show up at her daughter's house without warning, convinced that if they truly loved her, they wouldn't mind. But she noticed something. Her children grew distant, conversations became shorter, and visits felt more like obligations rather than moments of joy. One evening, after yet another ignored phone call, Helen sat in frustration. "Why doesn't anyone care anymore?" she muttered to herself. But then she caught sight of an old book on her shelf, a book on Buddhist philosophy that she had bought years ago but never finished. She flipped through the pages until a passage stopped her cold. To love without attachment is to give freedom. Clinging suffocates. Detachment allows love to breathe. She read it again and again, and suddenly it hit her. She wasn't being ignored. She was demanding more than what others could give. The next morning, instead of calling David, she sent him a short text. "Hope you have a great day. No need to reply. Just thinking of you." She didn't expect anything in return, and to her surprise, a few hours later, David called her. "Mom, that was so sweet. I miss you. Let's grab lunch this weekend." Helen smiled. Maybe, just maybe, she had been holding on too tightly. Buddhism teaches loving detachment, the ability to love without clinging. True love allows space. It doesn't demand. It doesn't control. And when we respect the boundaries of those we love, something magical happens. They come closer on their own. A mindful approach. If someone doesn't answer immediately, trust that they will when they can. If you feel lonely, instead of demanding attention, extend kindness to someone else, a neighbor, a friend, even a stranger. Turn your longing into giving. When love is given freely, without expectation, it has a way of returning in the most beautiful and unexpected ways. At the end of the day, love is not measured by how often someone calls or visits. It's measured by the warmth that remains, even in silence. And when we let go of the need to grasp, we open our hearts to deeper, more fulfilling connections built on mutual respect, not obligation. Final thoughts. Cultivating connection with wisdom and compassion. Aging is not about fading into the background. It is about stepping into a new phase of life with grace, wisdom, and an open heart. But as we have explored, certain patterns can unknowingly create distance between us and those we love. Yet just as a river carves its path over time, we too have the power to shape the way we experience our relationships. When we shift negativity into gratitude, we invite warmth instead of pushing people away. When we offer wisdom with humility rather than imposition, we become mentors rather than critics. When we embrace change with curiosity, we remain engaged in the world rather than isolated from it. When we balance giving and receiving, we cultivate bonds built on mutual respect rather than obligation. And when we learn to live fully in the present and honor the boundaries of those around us, we create space for deeper, more meaningful connections. The Buddha once said, "Thousands of candles can be lit from a single candle, and the life of the candle will not be shortened." Happiness never decreases by being shared. So let us be that candle. Let us be the light that brings warmth, the presence that brings comfort, and the wisdom that brings understanding. Instead of holding on to expectations, let's choose to give freely kindness, patience, appreciation, and love. Because in the end, what matters most is not how many years we have lived, but how deeply we have connected. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Which insight resonated with you the most? Have you noticed these patterns in your own relationships? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your wisdom may inspire someone else on this journey. And if you found value in this video, consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications so you never miss another opportunity to grow, reflect, and cultivate wisdom together. Thank you for watching, and until next time, may you walk your path with peace, compassion, and an open heart.